Why would someone want to spend an eternity with a God they rejected their entire lives? I think there's actually a pretty simple answer. Let's talk about it. Like and subscribe, please and thank you. All right, so I heard this question asked fairly recently, actually. Why would someone want to spend eternity with God if they spent their entire lives rejecting God? Why wouldn't they just reject God afterward? And honestly, this one boils down to another argument for God doesn't send people to hell, people choose hell. It kind of feels like another attempt to defend hell and also God's goodness at the same time, which I've stated before, I don't think makes sense. Before we go much further, let me reiterate, I don't believe in a traditional hell, and it is because of arguments like this that don't make sense to me, honestly. But in this version, someone is rejecting God intentionally. Someone has rejected God their entire life, and now for the rest of eternity is going to continue to reject God. They're making an intentional decision to reject God. And that's where I think this argument doesn't really make sense to me. Because this one kind of feels like people are looking over here at heaven and then looking over here at hell and saying, I will take hell. Which, why would anybody do that? I think the only real answer is they don't have adequate information to make the decision. Nobody would look at God and say, I don't want to be there, I would rather be over here. No one would look at heaven and say, I don't want to be there, I'd rather be over here. To me, that it just doesn't make sense unless they don't have adequate information. And I think that's where this argument falls apart for me. Because not everyone who is not following Jesus now rejected him at some point in their lives. In order to reject God, we would have to have encountered God at some point. We can't reject something we've never experienced, something we've never encountered, something we've never even heard of. And so in order to say we're rejecting God, we at the very least would have to say everyone has heard or has experienced God at some point. And I know some people have tried to make that argument that everyone has because of nature, or there's a verse in Romans, and that's fine, but to me that falls apart very quickly. To me that doesn't make sense. There are certainly people who have never experienced Jesus in this life. And this happens for a variety of reasons. There's this classic example of people living in a jungle in Africa that have honestly just straight up never heard the name of Jesus at any point in their life. Certainly at points throughout history that was the case. There's these thought experiments about people that live on an island and never hear about Jesus, never hear the name of God, and what happens to them. I don't think it's fair in any way to say that those people are rejecting God. To say that you're rejecting a God that you've never heard of, to me is nonsense. So to start with, not everyone experiences God at some point in their life. Not everyone meets him, not everyone hears that name at any point in their life. But this can also just be for other reasons. I mean, someone who grows up in another country might just not hear the name of Jesus. Someone who grows up in another religion, like for example, I didn't hear the name Allah until I was much later in life. I think I was well into college when I actually heard that said. It just didn't come up for me, so far as I remember anyway. And that could very easily happen for someone, that they're just raised in a different culture, a different area, a different place, where the name of Jesus, where God is just not talked about very often, and they honestly do not encounter him at any point in their life. I think it's also important to talk about people who have different lengths of their life. We hear about tragedies of high school students who lose their life early, always tragically, for a variety of reasons. And if you're someone who believes in an age of accountability, where there is a point in life where you're accountable for your actions, it's very possible that some of these students were only into that stage for 2 years, 1 year, a few months. It's theoretically possible only a few minutes were they accountable for their actions when they were in that car accident or when that tragedy struck. And I don't see how it would be fair to say that that person has rejected God, especially if they only had a few small years or less to experience God and decide to make a decision to follow that God. So I don't think it's fair to say everyone who is not following Jesus is rejecting Jesus, especially because many of them have straight up have not heard about him. They have not encountered him at any point. There are also others who have been told a lie about who Jesus is. They've experienced God, but in a very negative way. I think a very powerful example of this is American slavery, where we had humans that were enslaved, born into slavery and died in slavery, born into abuse and died in abuse. And their very abusers were holding up a book and saying, this book says it's okay for me to treat you this way. This book says it's okay for me to own you. And that book was the Bible. And a very logical conclusion, you and I would come to the same conclusion, is I want nothing to do with that God. Of course that God doesn't love me. Of course that God is not going to rescue anybody. Of course I want nothing to do with that God, the one who is telling you it is okay to abuse me. But similar situations are happening today. Church hurt is a very real thing. to the person who was forced to go to church by an abusive parent, for the student whose youth pastor was malicious and criminal, the person raised in church who only later in life learned that their pastor was covering up abuses the entire time. Someone raised in Westboro Baptist Church. I don't know if they're still up and running and active. I haven't heard their name in a while. But that is a false depiction of Jesus. Not only were they not introduced to Jesus, they were introduced to a version that is abusive, that is malicious. And of course you would reject that God. But that's not the same as rejecting Jesus. That's not the same as rejecting God. Any one of us would have rejected that God. A God of abuse, a God of neglect. No, we would never do that. I wouldn't want anything to do with that God either. And so while there are some people I think that never meet God, I think there are some people that meet a false version of God. And to say that that is rejecting God, I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's true. Because again, they haven't experienced him. They haven't met him. They haven't actually encountered Jesus at any point. And I don't think anyone rejects Jesus once they've met him. I don't think so. I think that love is irresistible. Truly irresistible. Once we've encountered it. I think it's illogical to say someone would meet Jesus and say, no thanks, I'm good. Unconditional perfect love is irresistible. And I don't think anyone rejects God after they've actually met him, when they've had that actual experience. And I think for many people, that first experience is after this life. And so why would someone want to spend eternity with a God that they spent their entire life rejecting? I think because they met him. Just because they met him. Just because they met him. Because they had an actual experience with God. They actually encountered Jesus for the first time. I think that's why. So once again, I don't think people choose hell. I don't think God sends people to hell. I don't think that's consistent with the nature of God. And I think this argument of, people, they reject God now, why wouldn't they reject God later? I think because they met him. And I think someday it will be face to face. I think someday we will have that encounter with Jesus. We will have that actual experience, the real thing. Unconditional love on display right in front of us. And I think at that point there will be no rejecting from anybody. Even the worst of the worst will just crumble at that point and say, this is what I want. This is what I've always wanted. I don't think there's any rejecting Jesus once you meet him. So I think I'm going to leave this one at that. That feels like a good place to stop. Like, subscribe, leave a nice comment, leave a mean comment, whatever feels good. I'll talk to you soon.